Confident Speaking Podcast, where you can learn to speak English with natural rhythm, real confidence, and fluency.
Welcome back to Confident Speaking Podcast. I'm Christina, and today we're diving into something that can transform the way you communicate in English. Whether you're preparing for your IELTS speaking exam, getting ready for a job interview, or simply wanting to have more engaging conversations with friends, what you're about to learn will elevate your speaking skills. We're going to explore the most effective ways to sound fluent, advanced, and professional when responding to questions. Throughout this lesson, you'll discover powerful phrases and structures for expressing your preferences, sharing your opinions, discussing past experiences, exploring hypothetical scenarios, giving balanced perspectives, providing examples, and even handling those moments when you're uncertain. These aren't just academic exercises. These are real-world communication tools that native speakers use every single day. And to make this even more valuable, we have prepared a free PDF guide just for you. Inside, you will discover all the key phrases, the reflective questions, and the grammar practice related to today's episode, available in the description below. Now let's dive right in and start building your confidence. Expressing your preferences. Let's begin with preferences. This comes up constantly in conversation. You're asked to choose between two or more options and explain your choice. Think about questions like, do you prefer studying in the morning or at night? Or, would you rather work from home or in an office? These require you to clearly state what you prefer and why. Here's a professional way to begin your response. I'd say, which is the shortened form of I would say. For example, I'd say I generally prefer studying in the morning. Notice how natural this sounds? You're stating your preference confidently while leaving room for flexibility. You can strengthen this by adding the contrast. I'd say I generally prefer studying in the morning over at night. This shows you've considered both options before making your choice. Another excellent approach is to describe your typical behavior. I tend to do something. When you say you tend to do something, you're indicating this is your usual pattern or habit. For instance, I tend to study in the morning more than at night. This communicates consistency without sounding rigid. If you want to be even more direct, you can simply say, most of the time I study at night. Straightforward and clear. Here's a more sophisticated strategy. Provide your reasoning first, then state your preference. I'm most alert in the morning, so that's when I study. See how this works. You're giving context before revealing your choice, which makes your answer more logical and compelling. You can also create interesting contrast by referencing how your preferences have evolved over time. Use the structure I used to, followed by the base form of the verb. I used to prefer evenings, but my work schedule has changed, so now I study in the mornings. This demonstrates growth and adaptability, qualities that impress in any conversation. Remember, these opening phrases are just your foundation. After stating your preference, you'll need to expand with reasons, examples, or personal experiences to create a complete and engaging response. Sharing your opinions. Now let's move on to expressing opinions. This is when you're sharing what you think about something, whether you agree or disagree or just presenting your general perspective on a topic. Imagine someone asks you, do you think children should learn to cook at school? You need to share your viewpoint clearly and confidently. The classic opener is, in my opinion. In spoken English, I recommend adding a brief pause after this phrase. It mirrors the natural comma you'd use in writing and gives your listener a moment to prepare for your perspective. In my opinion, pause, children should learn to cook at school. Of course, this is just your opening. You'll need to follow up with supporting reasons and explanations. Want to show you're open-minded while still expressing your view? Try this. It depends on the situation, but I'd say, for example, it depends on the situation, but I'd say children should learn to cook at school. This approach shows intellectual flexibility. You're acknowledging that circumstances matter, but you still have a clear position. You're demonstrating nuanced thinking, which is highly valued in both academic and professional contexts. When you want to be direct and authentic, start with, "to be honest." This phrase is wonderful because it gives you a moment to collect your thoughts while signaling that you're about to share something genuine or perhaps unexpected. To be honest, pause. I'm completely opposed to teaching children how to cook at school. This opener is perfect when your opinion might differ from the mainstream view or when you're about to be particularly candid. You can also use honestly in the same way. They're interchangeable. Honestly, I completely support teaching children how to cook at school. Both versions sound natural and confident. Here's a phrase that native speakers frequently use in both professional settings and casual conversations. As far as I'm concerned. This is a longer phrase, so make sure you pronounce it clearly. As far as I'm concerned. Notice that soft D sound at the end. This is essentially equivalent to in my opinion or I think, but it sounds more sophisticated. As far as I'm concerned, children should focus on the most important academic subjects at school. This phrase adds weight to your opinion and shows you've given the matter serious consideration. Describing past experiences. Let's shift our focus to discussing past experiences. This skill is essential when you're describing memorable moments, sharing stories, or answering questions about specific times in your life. In an IELTS exam, you might hear, "Describe a time when you traveled somewhere new." In a job interview, it could be, "Describe a time when you handled a difficult situation." The key is learning how to adapt these structures to various contexts, so they become natural tools you can use daily, not just for exams or formal interviews. Since these situations occurred in the past, you'll want to ground your response in that time frame. A powerful way to begin is with, "I remember." Notice that remember is in the present simple tense. I remember back in 2019 when I took my first trip abroad. You could simply say in 2019, but adding back in emphasizes that you perceive this as being some time ago. It creates a sense of distance and reflection. I remember back in 2019 when I took my first trip abroad. This opening immediately transports your listener to that moment with you. Of course, this is just the beginning of your response. After this opening, you'll need to fill in the details. What happened, how you felt, what you learned, and why it matters. Here's another excellent option that sounds very natural. One time that really stands out. Native speakers use this frequently. When something stands out, it means it's particularly memorable. It rises above other similar experiences in your mind. One time that really stands out is when I visited the United States for the first time. This phrase signals to your listener that what you're about to share is significant and worth paying attention to. You can also use the first experience that comes to mind. For example, The first trip that comes to mind is my weekend camping trip with my family last month. This phrase suggests immediacy. It's the example that surfaced most quickly in your thoughts, which implies it's particularly important or recent. Another effective approach is to directly reference the time frame. The last time you can incorporate the language from the original question, which creates coherence. The last time I traveled somewhere new was 3 years ago, and I attended my friend's wedding in Greece. Again, this is your opening. You'd continue by elaborating on the experience itself. Here's a particularly impactful phrase. I can clearly recall. The word recall is another term for remember, and adding the adverb clearly is powerful. Remember that adverbs are optional in English sentences, so when you choose to use one, it carries extra weight. Clearly suggests you have a vivid, detailed memory. I can clearly recall the moment when I saw the Eiffel Tower for the first time. When you use this structure, you're setting high expectations. You're signaling that something truly memorable or extraordinary happened. Make sure your subsequent description lives up to that promise. Of course, what's memorable or amazing is subjective and personal to you. Discussing hypothetical situations. Now let's explore hypothetical scenarios. These are imaginary situations, things that haven't actually happened, but that you're invited to consider. They often include words like if, could, or would. For instance, if you could live in any city, where would you choose? The clearest way to respond is to mirror the structure of the question. If I could live in any city, I would live in San Francisco. By echoing the grammatical structure, you create a clear, easy-to-follow response. Then, naturally, you'd continue by explaining your reasoning. You have some alternative ways to express the same idea. You could say, if I had the chance, I would definitely live in Vancouver. The phrase, if I had the chance, expresses that this opportunity would be welcome if it became available. Or you can simplify it further. I would likely choose Tokyo. Here, you're using likely to indicate a probability of about 50-60%. Want to sound more certain? Replace likely with definitely. I would definitely choose Tokyo. Now you're expressing 80, 90, or even 95% certainty. Here's an interesting variation. Reverse the structure by starting with your choice. Seattle is a vibrant city, so I would live there if I had the chance. Notice how you're building curiosity by stating your conclusion first, then revealing the conditional circumstances. Or try this more sophisticated approach. Due to its proximity to my family, I would live in Seoul. This structure is advanced because you begin with your reason, due to its proximity. But you haven't yet specified what it refers to. This creates a moment of suspense, requiring your listener to wait for the reveal. I would live in Seoul. It's an elegant way to structure complex thoughts. Providing balanced answers. Sometimes you don't want to choose one side or the other. You want to present a balanced perspective that acknowledges multiple viewpoints. For example, if someone asks, do you think young people prefer cities or rural areas? And you want to discuss both options rather than picking just one, you'll need different language strategies. You can open with, well, it really depends on the person. The word well at the beginning is optional. It doesn't add concrete meaning, but native speakers use it constantly. It shows you're reflecting on the question, gathering your thoughts, and forming a considered response. It's a natural thinking marker. Well, it really depends on the person. You could also say, It depends on the situation, or it depends on, followed by another relevant noun. After this opening, you'd proceed to explore both perspectives. Alternatively, you can structure your response with some people while others. Some people prefer lively cities, while others prefer quiet rural areas. Notice how I've included descriptive adjectives, lively for cities and quiet for rural areas. These adjectives give you something concrete to expand upon in your discussion, making your response richer and more nuanced. Another professional approach is, there are good arguments on both sides. This signals that you could make a compelling case for either option. There are good arguments on both sides. Of course, good is just one possible adjective. You might say strong arguments or valid arguments, depending on your emphasis. After making the statement, you would then lay out those arguments, giving each side fair consideration. A similar structure uses, there are pros and cons to both. Pros and cons simply means positives and negatives. This phrasing immediately sets up a balanced exploration. You can also combine approaches. Start with, it depends on the person, and then elaborate. It depends on the person. Some individuals thrive in the energy of cities, while others find peace in rural settings. You're acknowledging individual differences while preparing to discuss what makes each option appealing to different personality types. Finally, you might say, that's difficult to answer because it comes down to personal preference. The phrase comes down to means you're identifying the fundamental consideration, the core issue that must be taken into account. It comes down to personal preference. This acknowledges the complexity of the question while positioning you to explore those varied preferences. Offering examples. Let's talk about providing examples. This is incredibly common in IELTS exams, job interviews, and everyday conversations. You might hear, can you give an example of when you worked collaboratively? This could apply to academic teamwork, workplace projects, or community activities. When a question starts with, can you, it's professional to acknowledge that request before diving into your example. You can say, certainly. This is affirming, yes, I can, in an elegant way. Certainly. For example, last month I was part of a project. Then you'd continue describing your role and how the collaboration unfolded. Instead of certainly, you might say absolutely. The first example that comes to mind, the phrase, the first example that comes to mind, indicates this is what you thought of immediately. It suggests the example is readily accessible in your memory, which implies its significance. Absolutely. The first example that comes to mind is when I joined a soccer team, and you'd explain why team sports exemplify collaboration. Here's another warm, positive response. I'd love to. This is the contraction of I would love to, and it conveys enthusiasm about sharing. I'd love to. A great example of working collaboratively is when I was asked to organize a conference. Notice how you're introducing your example as a great example, which sets a positive tone. Or you could say, definitely. The best example of working collaboratively is a project I'm on now. This is interesting because it shows that your example doesn't have to be from the past. You can discuss current experiences if they're relevant and compelling. The most casual yet still professional option is simply, sure, one example I can share is, native speakers absolutely use this, especially in less formal contexts. Sure, one example I can share is when I volunteered at my daughter's school. It's conversational, friendly, and effective. Handling uncertainty. There will inevitably be moments when you're asked about something you don't know much about, or when you're uncertain, but you still need to provide a thoughtful response. Imagine someone asks, "When do you think space travel will become accessible to the average person?" They're expecting a specific time frame, but perhaps you haven't deeply considered this topic. The key is to be honest while still engaging with the question. You can say, "Honestly, I don't know," but, and this is crucial, don't stop there. Simply saying, "I don't know," is conversation ending and doesn't demonstrate critical thinking, whether you're in a formal exam, a job interview, or even a friendly chat. Adding "honestly" before "I don't know" makes you sound more confident and sincere. Honestly, I don't know, but I imagine it will happen this century. See what happened there? Instead of giving a precise answer, you've offered a broader time frame. This century spans many decades, which is appropriately vague given your uncertainty. But you haven't dodged the question. The important next step is to explain your reasoning. Why do you think it might happen within this century? That follow-up transforms your response from evasive to thoughtfully engaged. Another option, "I'm not entirely sure." Adding "entirely" softens your admission of uncertainty. "I'm not entirely sure, but I suppose it could happen in the next 20 years. The word "suppose" is another way of saying "think," though it carries a slightly more tentative tone. Again, you're providing a general time frame rather than committing to a specific date, which is perfectly appropriate when you're uncertain. You might also say, "I can't say for certain, but I think my grandkids will experience this." This is a clever strategy because you're using your own life as a reference point. Depending on your age, your listener can estimate when your grandchildren, current or future, might be adults, giving them a rough sense of your timeline. It's an indirect but effective way to answer. Here's another excellent opening. "Well, I haven't thought about that before." This is wonderfully honest and gives you a moment to formulate your thoughts. "Well, I haven't thought about that before. It may happen by 2035. You're not claiming expertise. You're acknowledging this is a spontaneous consideration, and then you offer a reasoned estimate. Following up with your reasoning makes this response complete and thoughtful. Remember we discussed saying, "That's a difficult question" earlier. This is the perfect time to use it. "That's a difficult question. If I had to guess, I would say in the next 100 years. The phrase, "if I had to guess," creates context for your answer. You're positioning it as speculation rather than informed prediction, which is honest and appropriate. In the next 100 years is intentionally broad, covering any time frame between now and a century from now. But paired with your reasoning, this becomes a complete professional response rather than an evasion. Conclusion and next steps. You now have a comprehensive toolkit of conversation starters that will help you answer questions professionally and confidently in English. These aren't just phrases to memorize. They're flexible structures you can adapt to countless situations, from high-stakes exams and interviews to everyday conversations with colleagues and friends. Are you excited to continue learning more about answering questions effectively? If you are, I'd love to hear from you. Write "Let's go" in the comments below. And please take a moment to like this lesson and share it with your friends who are also on their English learning journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you're notified every time I post a new lesson. And because your learning shouldn't stop here, I've prepared another lesson that perfectly complements what you've learned today. Watch it now to continue building your speaking confidence.
Thanks for tuning in to Confident Speaking Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe to Master English Fluency.